Welcome all. Good morning, good afternoon. If you are here, that means you're interested in the NRCS Regional Conservation Partnership Program. Specifically, you're interested in RCPP and funding conservation easements through your RCPP project proposal. There are a couple of other RCPP webinars taking place, and this one is specific to easements. So thank you, welcome. We have the tremendous and fortunate opportunity to offer the Regional Conservation Partnership Program to our producers and landowners across the United States. There were 2 notice of funding opportunities that were announced on April 3rd. One for classic RCPP and one for alternative funding arrangements RCPP. Those notice of funding opportunities are available until July 2nd. So with that, let's get started. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you, Danielle. We just went over the introduction. Again, welcome you all. So we are going to be talking about an overview of the Notice of Funding Opportunities. Marcus Griffin will be covering that section. Tim Aaron will be focusing on entity-held easements, and Michael Blancione will be focusing on U.S.-held easements. And then at the end, Stephanie Goyo will be covering proposal tips and covering the State Conservationist Questionnaire Easement Addendum that you will be using with your proposal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marcus Griffin for our first section.
Thank you, Carrie. Again, my name is Marcus Griffin. I serve as a natural resources specialist with the Easement Program Division, and I will cover the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the Notice of Funding Opportunity. This is an opportunity that was announced recently, April 3rd, 2024, for a classic and alternative funding arrangement that is running concurrently. And we have a deadline of about July the 2nd, 2024, 4:59 p.m. Eastern Daytime. And this opportunity has, for classic and alternative funding arrangement, is split up. It has a $1.5 billion fund available for this opportunity. And the way it's split up $300 million was allocated from the 2018 Farm Bill funds, with an additional $1.2 billion for Inflation Reduction Act. And 50% will go towards critical conservation area, and the other 50% will go towards multi-state funding pool. And I will get into the details of those next. Next slide. So let's talk about the funding pools. We have the state and multi-state funding pool, and this can include any RCPP resource concern or conservation benefit. However, the critical conservation area, or CCA, differs, and the project and all activities, including easements under this project, they must address at least one of those CCA specific priority resource concerns. So again, the state or multi-state can include any resource concern or conservation benefit, and the CCA must have at least one of those priority resource concerns that's listed in those priority areas. As far as the proposal, it cannot include multiple critical conservation areas. So it has to be one of those 8 critical conservation areas. And I would always encourage you to refer to or contact the local state RCPP coordinator if you have any questions, or you can go to the RCPP website for additional information. So again, deadline July 2nd, 2024. Let's talk about the individual project, the funding amount for individual projects. We have a maximum of $25 million for an individual project that a partner can apply for, and a minimum of $250,000 for an individual project. There is $100 million that have been set aside for classic and AFA regarding tribal entities, and there is a cap of 25% for technical assistance, all of the funds that go to TA. So that split out is 75% financial assistance and 25% for technical assistance. As far as the program overview, we focus on the eligible activities so that we know that they further conservation, protection, restoration, and sustainable use of soil, water, wildlife, agricultural land, and related natural resources on these eligible land for a regional or watershed scale. And as far as the where, that is where is on the eligible land, which is private or tribal agricultural land, non-industrial private forest land, or associated land on which an eligible activity would help achieve those conservation benefits, because we focus on those conservation benefits defined for an approved project. We have two additional overviews that we would like to focus on, and of course, that's the how NRCS and partners. We work collaboratively together to co-invest in conservation activities so that we can achieve these conservation benefits and also address these natural resources concern. And the duration for these agreements are typically 5 years. However, it may be extended for one time, no longer than 12 months from the original agreement or expiration date. So let's talk about RCPP eligible activities. There are 5 different eligible activities or components regarding RCPP, which include land management, rental, U.S. held easement, entity held easement, public work watersheds. And when you think about these activities, think about the associated programs that you may be more familiar with, which include the land management. That will be more like our cover program or associated program, environmental qualities incentive program, or the conservation stewardship program. And when you think of rental, think of the conservation reserve program that is administered under the Farm Service Agency. The U.S. held easement will be similar to the ACEP Wetland Reserve Easement Program, and the entity held easement will be more so like the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. And public works and watershed will be similar to the PL 566 public works and watershed programs. So just wanted to kind of give you some context on some of the programs that are associated with these different eligible activities. Of course, easement opportunities, we have 2 different easement opportunities, which include the entity held easement and also U.S. held easements. Regarding entity held easements, these are purchased and held by an eligible entity. The entity purchases those easements. That they fall under RCPP Classic and also RCPP Alternative Funding Arrangement. However, for U.S. held easements, that is purchased and held by the United States by and through NRCS. So, the government purchases those easements, and this is for RCPP Classic only. We can dive deep into the concerns, benefits, and values. So, of course, with RCPP, in all of our programs, we focus on resource concerns. And these are specific natural resource problems that are likely to be addressed successfully through the implementation of the eligible activities. The benefits are improvements in the status of those resource concerns and other similar goals in the RCPP project area. And also conservation values, they establish those specific purposes of the RCPP easement, and that is stated in the RCPP conservation easement deed later. So diving deeper into the conservation values, which will be explained later as well. What are conservation values? So the natural resources being protected and the resource concerns being addressed consistent with those conservation benefits. They are identified at the RCPP project level as agreed to in the individual RCPP programmatic partnership agreement, also known as PPA. The RCPP easements further the restoration, the protection, management, maintenance, enhancement, and monitoring of those conservation values on eligible land. And they are specifically identified in the individual easement deed. They are also derived from RCPP PPA conservation benefits and also resource concerns. And again, working with the local easement specialist and the state office or RCPP coordinator will assist you in identifying those conservation values. So as far as 2018 Farm Bill RCPP easement deed terms. There are three, and which include the highly restrictive, that is related to the restoration, the protection of native habitats in those natural historic conditions. And also there will be minimum disturbance, no agricultural uses, versus moderately restrictive, which will be a management of those specific habitats so that they can provide conservation benefits and conservation activities to maintain, manage, and for conservation values. Minimally restrictive, that will be more so related to the protection of agriculture uses, including grazing uses, and also rights related to those agricultural use remain. They relate, rights related to agricultural use remains. So let's talk about the roles and responsibilities for entity-held easement versus U.S.-held easements. As far as the responsibility for the RCPP funds for easements to purchase, so the entity-held easement, it is the eligible entity. They purchase the conservation easement from the eligible landowner. The U.S.-held easement, NRCS, for the sale of the conservation easement to the United States. So for purchasing entity-held easements, it's the eligible entity. And then also for U.S.-held, it's landowner, the NRCS for the sale of the NRCS for the sale of the conservation easement to United States. Easement purchase agreement, that is for entity-held easement, that is between the landowner and the eligible entity. And for U.S.-held easements, it is between the landowner and NRCS. As far as the acquisition-related items, i.e. the appraisal, survey, title, recording, that will be the eligible entity's responsibility under entity-held easements, and it will be NRCS responsibility for U.S.-held easements. So again, that pattern for entity-held easements rely on the entity, and for U.S.-held easement, be more so the government or NRCS. So the roles and responsibilities for the easement holder, again, for entity-held easements, the responsibility relies on the entity, and for the U.S.-held easement, it is United States by and through NRCS. As far as co-holders, other entities, they must be identified by the eligible entity, and there will be none for U.S.-held easements. For a third party, it will be the same process. Other entities are identified by eligible entity, and for U.S.-held easements, there are none. So pretty sure you guys are getting the pattern. As far as funds for required easement restoration, there are none for entity-held easements. However, for U.S.-held easements, restoration costs must be included in the project budget. So working with the state RCPP coordinator, easement specialist in the state, definitely make sure that those restoration costs are included in the project budget. And these are for highly and moderately restrictive easements only. As far as monitoring, stewardship, and enforcement of closed easements, it is the eligible entity's responsibility for entity-held easement, and for U.S.-held easements, it is NRCS. RCPP use of funds, as far as partner contributions, any portion of the non-federal share expended during the life of the PPA, that can count as contribution to RCPP project. Eligible entities cost for acquisition related items, that may count toward RCPP project contribution, but toward easement match non-federal share for easement purchase. RCPP TA funds, that may not be used for entity-held easement acquisition related costs, due diligence expenses, again, appraisal, surveys, titles, etc. Thank you, and I will pass the baton to Tim Aaron.
Thanks, Marcus. Hello, this is Tim Aaron. I'm a realty specialist with the NRCS Easement Programs Division, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the entity-held easements. And next slide, please. So specifically, I'm going to talk about some of the overall acquisition process for entity-held easements under RCPP, and including in that discussion a talk of some of the recent changes that resulted from NRCS's ongoing RCPP improvement efforts and the most recent NFO. And then we'll also talk about some issues we've seen over the past couple of years of implementing RCPP and how you might avoid those or get around those obstacles. So as far as the updates, and this is at a very high level, but the updates that we've seen that we'll discuss in the next several slides that came about as a result of the recent NFO and improvement efforts are first, allowing the use of alternative valuation methodologies. We have also allowed for, on certain circumstances, existing ASAP ALE certified entities to take advantage of some of the flexibilities afforded to those certified entities when they're acquiring some of the flexibilities that are afforded to certified entities under ALE will now be applicable to them under RCPP. The maximum federal cost share rate has been revised in the most recent NFO. In addition to the minimum deed terms that Marcus mentioned, we have also, I shouldn't say we have, I think we are in the next probably week publishing a set of sample RCPP deeds that will be available for use. And then finally, we've also approved or will allow for the use of approved ASAP ALE templates under certain circumstances. So we'll start with kind of an overview of the easement acquisition process, starting with your proposal. So your proposal, and I'm only talking about this with respect to the easement activities, but the proposal will describe the easement activities and what you as the partner are intending to protect with the easements, whether they're entity held or US held easements. At that time, as part of your proposal, you would also, if applicable, propose any alternative valuation methodologies, propose to be treated like a certified entity, to use an ALE template. This is the time to do it when you're putting out your proposal. Once the proposal is negotiated with NRCS, you will then enter into your programmatic partnership agreement or PPA. Once that PPA is in place, then you can enter into the Type 4 supplemental agreement, or what we call the program agreement, for entity-held easements. That starts with an entity application, and then a application for each specific parcel. Once those are entered into, or I should say, after those applications are submitted, there's a couple of options on how you proceed at that point, and it really depends on, and we'll discuss this in a few slides, how you get your how you determine the value for purposes of obligating the federal funds to the contract. So option one here, under option one, after you submit your application, you would also submit your draft deed. That deed would then get reviewed by NRCS, and if approved, then based on that deed, you would obtain your appraisal according to NRCS specifications, have that approved, and then now you have a fair market value that you can use to obligate the federal funds to the parcel contract, and at that point, you're almost ready to close. Option two, if you notice, there's one extra step in here, and that is because in this option, the obligation is being based on an estimate, and that estimate needs to be submitted to NRCS and approved, both the estimate and the methodology used to determine that estimate. At that point, then you would enter into the parcel contract, then get your deed approved, then get the appraisal approved and close. So you can see if it is feasible to get the deed and appraisal done before obligation, you will remove at least one step from the process. So the next couple of slides are going to jump around a little bit, but I wanted to kind of hit on some some topics that are either have changed recently or that have caused some issues in the past couple of years with implementation that we wanted to clear up. So as far as who is eligible as an entity to hold RCPP entity held easements, if you are familiar with ASAP ALE, it is very similar to that program insofar as who is eligible to participate. The only difference really is that under where it says that you have an established land protection program that purchases conservation easements that protect the types of natural resources being protected in the PPA, that is where it really differs from ALE in the sense that under ALE, you would just need to have a land protection program that protected agricultural land easements. But because there are various types of easements available under RCPP, that requirement is a little different under RCPP. Next slide, please. So I had mentioned certified entities. There are no certified entities under RCPP. However, in this year, we introduced the concept of allowing existing ASAP ALE certified entities to be able to quote unquote, act like a certified entity when they're acquiring RCPP entity held easements in certain limited circumstances. In order to avail yourself of those flexibilities, what would happen is at the time of the proposal, the lead partner would propose that they would like to use the alternative entity held easement process for certified entities, and either themselves or another entity whom they identify must be certified at that time. If NRCS approves that proposal, then that entity will the partner will indicate on their application that they want to proceed using the certified entity process, and then that certified entity process will be attached to the program agreement, and that will set forth the various different processes that will be followed. This last point is very important, is that this is limited to entity held easements that are ASAP ALE-like. And now what does that mean? That means that, because you're going to hear that a couple of times today, ASAP ALE-like means that the purpose of the easement and the deed terms are very similar to those that are used in ASAP ALE. So you're protecting agricultural use, agricultural viability, and you're using most likely the minimally restrictive deed terms. So if you are approved to act as a certified entity, these are the flexibilities that are afforded to you, which is as you see, for the most part, it's limited reviews by NRCS. It's the theme here is that there is less involvement of NRCS and more responsibility put on you as the certified entity to review all of the required documents. So in that vein, there is limited pre-closing reviews of the appraisals by NRCS. You can use the RCPP minimum deed requirements rather than the RCPP minimum deed terms. There is limited pre-closing NRCS deed review. Really, we're just checking to make sure that that deed is ALE-like. There is no NRCS review of the title prior to closing other than to check landowner names, and limited national internal controls reviews done by NRCS prior to closing. Now, many of these things, there will be post-closing reviews just for purposes of quality assurance, but you can see the route to closing review requires much less involvement and review by NRCS. All right, changing gears and going back to something that Marcus talked about, conservation values, or we call it sometimes the conservation value statement, which is synonymous with the purpose of the easement. And I'm repeating some of what Marcus said because this is a very important point and something that is important to understand. So in your PPA and proposal, you as the partner are going to set forth what you want to do with this easement, and what types of resource concerns you want to protect. Those will then be boiled down into a purpose of the easement or conservation value statement that you will set out in your application for entity-held easements. And so that purpose statement needs to address the resource concerns that you stated you were going to protect in the PPA. Those from the application, that conservation value statement will then be plugged into your parcel contract and ultimately into the deed. One note is that for projects within a critical conservation area, at least one of the priority resource concerns for that critical conservation area must be addressed in both the conservation value statement and ultimately in the easement deed. And that can be done in the easement deed through deed terms or potentially use of a RCPP plan. So one common issue that we've seen are what happens if the conservation value statement does not address the resource concerns? Or what if the conservation value statement addresses more resource concerns than are set forth in the PPA? Well, the conservation value statement or purpose of the easement must address the resource concerns stated in the PPA. It does not have to address all of the resource concerns, but it must address at least some of the resource concerns set forth in the PPA. If it is addressing other resource concerns beyond those that are stated in the PPA, that is acceptable so long as it is clear in the deed that the primary conservation purpose is the purpose for which the RCPP funding was provided. Okay, so we now have we've got our purpose statement, our conservation value statement. So what are the requirements with respect to the deed? You'll see here, I've got this broken out into a couple of different blocks under classic RCPP. Your options are to either attach or incorporate the RCPP minimum deed terms, one of the three versions that Marcus mentioned in his presentation, or you could elect to use one of the NRCS pre-approved sample deeds that I alluded to that we have recently or will be shortly releasing. Those right now, the ones that we have available or will have available is a agricultural deed similar to ASAP ALE, riparian area deed, and two forest land deeds, one for habitat and another one for at-risk species protection. So those are full deeds, meaning they're not like deed terms. These deeds are set up to really plug in your parcel specific information and use off the shelf. So that, and then beyond those options, as we mentioned previously, was you do have the potential to use an ASAP ALE template, which we'll talk about in more detail in a second. AFA under alternative funding arrangement, RCPP, or if you are approved to act like a ALE certified entity, any of those options I just mentioned are available. And in addition, you could use the RCPP minimum deed requirements, which I believe I have a slide about in a few slides. So I'll hold off on that one, but we'll get into those minimum deed requirements in a second. And then just as a reminder, under the AFA RCPP, there is no option for a U.S. right of enforcement. And just as a general requirement, I mentioned this when we're talking about the valuation, but the process to acquire an easement, but the deed must be approved by NRCS prior to the appraisal being completed. And that is simply because the appraisal valuation is based on whatever is in that deed. So it needs to be finalized before the appraisal is final. So now I'll go through in a little more detail some of those options. I've already talked about a lot of these, and Mark has talked about these, but there are three sets of minimum deed terms available for entity-held easements: the highly restrictive, moderately restrictive, and minimally restrictive. Each of those actually has two versions available, one with terms related to the United States right of enforcement and one without. And so of those minimum deed terms, it's the selection, which one you select is really based on what you're trying to protect. So if you're trying to protect agricultural land, you're most likely going to use the minimally restrictive deed terms because that allows for continued agricultural use. If, on the other hand, you're protecting habitat, then you might use either the moderately restrictive deed or the highly restrictive deed, depending on which restrictions are most appropriate to protect that resource. So now moving on to those pre-approved sample deeds I mentioned. I talked about those a minute ago, but just to reiterate, these deeds each already incorporate the minimum deed terms. And so they are going to satisfy NRCS deed requirements because so long as they're used as published. That said, they still must undergo an NRCS deed review. It will likely just be an abbreviated review, seeing as how we have already reviewed and published these deeds. We'd really just be checking to make sure that any blanks or whatever were filled in appropriately. Okay, going back to the option to use a template. If you already have an approved ASAP ALE template and you are acquiring ASAP ALE-like easements, then you may be approved to use that template on your RCPP easements. A couple things to note there: that template must have been approved under the 2018 Farm Bill for ALE, meaning that ASAP ALE templates approved under the 2014 Farm Bill would not satisfy that requirement. The proposal to use that must come as part of your PPA proposal, and NRCS will review that template and make changes to conform it to RCPP. At that point, the template would be available to be used for your ALE-like easements under RCPP. And finally, with respect to deeds, I mentioned the RCPP minimum deed requirements. These are available in addition to all the previously discussed options for AFA easements being acquired under an AFA, RCPP, PPA, or for entities approved to act like a certified entity for RCPP. And really what these are is a list of general requirements that must be included in any deed that is used to acquire the entity-held easements. And how that differs from the minimum deed terms is, while the minimum deed terms will provide, for example, a provision on prohibiting subdivision that must be incorporated verbatim into your deed, the minimum deed requirements would simply say that you must prohibit subdivision in your deed. So leaving flexibility on how you word that prohibition. And that's just one example, but that's how the whole minimum deed requirements work in comparison to the minimum deed terms. All right, next slide, please. And I think we're going to turn over to valuation now. So I mentioned previously on the kind of two routes you could go to acquire an entity-held easement, that one method used an estimate. When we're entering, if you're not going to get the appraisal and deed reviewed prior to entering into the parcel contract, then you must provide a defensible and documented estimate of the easement value, which must include the methodology used to determine that estimate. Obviously, using an NRCS approved appraisal is also an option that will avoid this whole requirement to get the estimate reviewed that I mentioned, that we'll talk about on the next slide, please. So if you are going to use an estimate, that estimate has to be approved by the NRCS National Appraiser. There's no specific form required to do this. It's really just you are proposing a certain value for this easement and then describing how you arrived at that value, and why that value is a reliable estimate of the easement value. So I've set forth just kind of a one way you might do that here, but this is by no means limiting or a methodology you have to follow. But in this case, if you were proposing basically an ALE-like easement, and you have already closed on a number of ALE easements recently in the same area, and all of those easements showed an average diminution in value of 60%, meaning that the easement had reduced the value of the property by 60%. And then you provide evidence that agricultural property in the area is currently valued at about $4,000 an acre. Then from those numbers and documentation supporting all these numbers, you arrive at an estimate of $2,400 an acre for this ASAP ALE-like easement. So that's just one way you could do that. So again, I've hit on this a number of times, but I'm going to hit it one more time, which is that if it is within your means to do it, the appraisal really ought to be obtained prior to obligation, because then you don't have to worry about anything we talked about on the last two slides. The parcel is almost ready to close at the time the parcel contract is entered into. Either way, like we said, the deed needs to be submitted and approved before that appraisal is completed. One thing that has changed recently is the time, how long the appraisal is good for. So previously, it was the appraisal had to be completed no more than 6 months prior to the parcel contract being entered into. That has now been extended to 12 months, which is done in recognition of the idea that in order to do all these things, the deed review and appraisal and getting the appraisal approved and going through NRCS internal controls might take some time. And if you're going to go that route of getting the appraisal done prior to obligation, we wanted to make sure there was plenty of time, and so that appraisal didn't expire. The FY23, this is also not the most recent one, but the one prior to that, allowed for the use of alternative valuation methods in place of the standard USPAP appraisal that is used by NRCS for RCPP easements. If you would like to use an alternative valuation method, that should be included in your proposal, and in there explaining why the valuation method, why that is similar to the estimate. Why is this a reasonable way to determine the fair market value of this easement? A couple of examples here, nothing specific. It's really, whatever alternative valuation method you have, you can propose, but that might be an existing appraisal process that you use that differs from the USPAP appraisal that NRCS uses, or some other industry approved or industry standard valuation method. Again, if you're going to use one of these methods, or you'd like to use one, consult with your state RCPP coordinator and the EPD national appraiser before and during submitting your proposal. So again, on the easement value, typically this is done within a before and after appraisal, but that fair market value could also be determined using the alternative valuation method. Once you have an easement value, then we can determine what the maximum federal share is. But that federal share is going to be some percentage of the fair market value of the easement that the United States can contribute to the easement purchase. And I've got a chart on, I believe, the next slide that's going to show that federal share is going to vary based on a couple of factors. One is the year of the applicable notice of funding opportunity, because this has changed a couple times throughout the NFOs, and those changes are not retroactive. Also depends on whether or not it's an AFA or a classic RCPP, whether or not the United States will have a right of enforcement, and the involvement of historically underserved landowners. The non-federal share or the remainder of the easement value could be comprised of cash from the partner or a donation from the landowner. That reduces the easement purchase price. So here you'll see what I was just alluding to, which is that the federal share varies based on a number of factors. One consistent thing through if you're under a classic RCPP and there are no historically underserved landowners involved, it's fairly straightforward. It's 50% with a right of enforcement and 25% without a right of enforcement, and that is 50% of the fair market value of the easement. Under the 23 NFO, if the easement was going to, it will directly facilitate the purchase of land by a historically underserved producer, then you could add an additional 25% federal share, which would mean with a right of enforcement, you could the federal share could be up to 75% of the fair market value and 50% without. In the FY24 notice of funding opportunity, that language regarding historically underserved producers changed slightly. Actually became a bit broader in saying that any entity held easement being purchased on land owned or being purchased by historically owned landowners gets that additional 25%. On AFA easements, you'll see there's no U.S. right of enforcement other than in the 2019 NFO, but after that, there was no U.S. right of enforcement. So it was 25% was the maximum federal share available all the way up until fiscal year 24, the most recent NFO, in which still had that same, well, two things changed. One, the cost share rate increased to 40%, and then the additional 25% was made available for easements being purchased on lands owned or being purchased by historically underserved landowners, meaning that percentage could go up from 40% to 65%. So this chart will be published as part of the manual in case you want to reference it, or these numbers are also all available within these respective notice of funding opportunities. And with that, next slide, I believe I will turn it over to Michael Blancioni to discuss RCPP U.S. held easements.
Hello, as Tim said, I'm Michael Blancioni. I'm a realty specialist on the easement acquisitions branch within the easement programs division of NRCS. And yeah, I'm going to go over some details about the U.S. held easements. Most of you know, or some of you may know, that NRCS has been acquiring conservation easements through our various easement programs for over 30 years. So U.S. held easements, or easements held by the NRCS, is not really new to us. However, most of our easement programs have a fixed program purpose, specific eligibility requirements, and are designed to achieve a specific result. For example, in our Healthy Forest Reserve easements, the restoration and protection of private forest land for the benefit of listed species is the defined purpose, the only defined purpose. Under existing programs, the targeted conservation values are set in program rules, and the deeds we use to acquire the easements are standard and fixed. So where RCPP differs from those other easement programs is that the programmatic purposes of RCPP are broad, but become narrowed on an individual RCPP project basis, initially in the PPA, and then further in the processing of individual transactions. And Marcus and Tim touched on that as well. The purposes of RCPP are tied to conservation benefits, which are variable and defined in an individual project. So the variability and flexibilities embedded in RCPP create opportunities to protect and restore conservation values and natural resources NRCS might not otherwise be able to. but those same flexibilities require us to clearly identify objectives of a proposal and then a PPA down to an easement deed that accomplishes those goals. To accomplish the flexibilities of RCPP, but to also provide some consistency nationwide and protect the investment of the United States, NRCS has 3 warranty easement deed forms available under RCPP. The deed selected for a particular project or property must align with the desired conservation values. The 3 easement deed forms contain standard terms that cannot be changed and cannot be mixed and matched among the forms. It is critical, as we've said several times, to select the deed that matches the intended future condition of the easement. The conservation value statement and purpose of the deed must be drafted early and must be consistent with the deed form that is selected. While the body of the deed and its terms are fixed and cannot be changed, the moderately and minimally restrictive easements require an Exhibit E that may also identify additional rights reserved to the landowner for certain conservation uses or activities and may include additional prohibitions. The Exhibit E permitted uses and prohibitions, just like the deed itself, must support the conservation values, which again stem from the purposes, resource concerns, and conservation benefits identified in the PPA. For all U.S.-held easements, NRCS enters into the purchase agreement directly with the landowner. NRCS conducts all of the easement acquisition activities and may also provide funding for required restoration practices. You can see on this slide the names and the form numbers for the 3 U.S.-held easement deeds. The names alone can tell you a little bit about which deed is appropriate for what kind of objectives. As I mentioned, the terms of the deeds themselves cannot be changed. Each easement deed has one spot where the conservation values are added, and that is the extent of the tailoring in the deed itself. I'll show you that on the next slide as well. One thing to highlight here is that the moderately restrictive easement, as it says in the name, is for conservation uses, and to us that is still habitat and species driven. Any conservation activities that are reserved to the landowner must be in furtherance of the habitat goals. For example, if it is a forest land easement, then forest management activities are only permitted to accomplish the specific forest habitat and species goals. So like full timber production as an agricultural activity wouldn't be allowed on that type of easement. These standard deed forms, along with the agreement to purchase that we enter into with the landowner, are all available online or from NRCS easement staff. In the future, NRCS plans to also make available in the RCPP resources library some model deeds based on these standard deeds or other easement programs. This is similar to the sample deeds that Tim talked about. And these model deeds may be used for RCPP US-held easement deeds if appropriate. NRCS also does have a side-by-side comparison guide for these 3 deed forms. NRCS easement staff should be able to provide that, and it also will be available on the resources library. It is a good tool, and I'll actually show portions of it on slides later. So this is the purposes intent language from all 3 of the deed forms, and as you can see, it's where we would enter the specific conservation values applicable to the PPA and the specific property. To help NRCS and partners draft the conservation value statement, we do have a list of examples. I will go through some of these examples in the next slides, but they're also available from NRCS easement staff and will be available on the RCPP resources library. So here are the 2 example conservation value statements we think might fit a highly restrictive easement. Please note that the examples we show here are not an exhaustive list, nor is anything that are in them. None of that is considered like required language, but they are good examples based on our other easement programs. The top one shown here is similar to the purpose and conservation values in our wetland reserve easements. And the bottom one is similar to that really, but maybe geared more towards floodplain easements. And here are 2 example conservation value statements that may be appropriate in a moderately restrictive easement. Remember, in a moderately restrictive easement, certain conservation uses may be reserved to the landowner, and the implementation of those activities would be guided by the terms of the Exhibit E and the RCPP easement plan, but would not require a separate compatible use authorization, since these uses are actually reserved to the landowner in the deed. So if more active management is needed to achieve the particular conservation values on these easements, and we want the landowner to retain the right to conduct those activities, the moderately restrictive easement may be a good fit. Here are the two example conservation value statements that we think might be appropriate in a minimally restrictive easement. The minimally restrictive easement is for working lands. So these conservation value statements are for general agricultural use or specifically for grazing and grassland use. That's similar to the entity held easements as well. So I mentioned the RCPP U.S. held easement deed comparison guide. This is just a portion of it. What this guide provides is like a side-by-side comparison of the three warranty easement deeds, the purpose, the rights reserved to the landowner, the obligations of the landowner, the prohibitions, and the rights of the United States. You can see for the less restrictive easements, there are more rights reserved to the landowner and fewer prohibitions. As we keep saying over and over, these must align with the proposed purpose and intent of the easement. And just as a reminder, all RCPP U.S. held easement deeds are reserved interest deeds, meaning that any rights not specifically reserved to the landowner are being acquired by the United States. This is generally a little different than how an entity held easement may be drafted. This is just another clip of the deed comparison guide. And again, you can see that the least restrictive an easement is, the more rights that are reserved to the landowner, conveying fewer rights to the United States. So I'm just going to go through a quick example of how you might use this deed comparison guide when trying to select the appropriate deed for a PPA or for a specific property. So in this example, the identified conservation value is to maximize the functions and values of the vernal pool habitat for the benefit of listed species that rely on that habitat and to improve water quality in the downstream watershed. The land itself must have the appropriate physical characteristics and features, for example, soils, hydrology, landscape position, vegetative communities, to provide that vernal pool habitat. Through assessment and preliminary planning, NRCS has determined that vegetation management through prescribed grazing specifically tailored to vernal pool communities will most effectively achieve the identified conservation values. As a result, NRCS identifies the moderately restrictive RCPP easement deed as the appropriate deed because under the moderately restrictive easement, the right to conduct conservation activities such as grazing in accordance with the terms of the deed and the RCPP easement plan are reserved to the landowner. Note, though, that prescribed grazing has only been identified as a permitted conservation activity because NRCS believes it is the appropriate tool to achieve the identified conservation values. This is in contrast to the highly restrictive RCPP U.S. held easement, where grazing rights are not and cannot be reserved to the landowner. This is also in contrast to the minimally restrictive easement, which may allow grazing uses on the easement area, but would not necessarily ensure the grazing was conducted in a way to maximize the functions and values of the vernal pool habitat. In these last two examples, while the land itself is technically capable of supporting vernal pool habitats, the terms of the highly and minimally restrictive easement deeds would not be best aligned with ensuring the stated conservation values would be achieved. So the moderately restrictive easement deed is the most appropriate. So once the conservation values are agreed upon and the conservation value statement and Exhibit E of the easement deed are approved, if an individual easement application has been tentatively selected, NRCS will procure an individual appraisal to establish easement value and compensation to be paid to the landowner at closing. RCPP easements, U.S. held and entity held, require a before and after appraisal, and this is similar to what partners are already used to using for ASEP agricultural land easements with NRCS or for their own conservation easements. Like our other U.S. held easement programs, for RCPP U.S. held easements, the appraisal is required prior to entering into an agreement for purchase with the landowner, so prior to obligation. So Marcus covered the next few slides a bit, or he touched on it. I'm going to go in a little bit more detail specific for U.S. held easements. But during our planning process, preliminary planning, NRCS may identify restoration needs that must be fulfilled in order for the site to be eligible. So this required restoration would only be applicable to moderately or highly restrictive easements. NRCS actually purchases the right to conduct required restoration activities through the easement deed. The deed provides us those rights. For particular lands to be eligible, funds must also be available in the PPA to complete all required restoration. Note that this does not include additional conservation practices that the landowner may request or an NRCS may recommend. So it's only for the ones that we say are required to achieve the conservation values. For minimally restrictive easements, since we can't or don't identify required restoration, there are opportunities to identify conservation practices that would be appropriate to treat resource concerns, but those would be like separately applied for under like an RCPP land management rental contract or through our other financial assistance programs. Since I'm talking about RCPP US held easements only, NRCS is solely responsible for the acquisition of the easement, including obtaining and paying for easement acquisition related items. So NRCS will pay up to 100% of the easement acquisition related costs for all US held easements. And NRCS may also pay up to 100% of the cost for restoration if we have determined that restoration is required to meet the purposes of the easement. So all technical assistance, and I think Marcus mentioned this as well, all technical assistance and financial assistance costs for the RCPP US held easement must be accounted for in the PPA budget. For US held easements, the financial assistance financial assistance costs include the cost of the easement itself. So like the compensation paid to the landowner for the easement, all acquisition related costs, for example, the appraisal cost, title services, environmental record search, and the boundary survey that we do. This financial assistance cost might also include the required restoration activities that I mentioned, and also costs for procurement of the baseline documentation report if NRCS decides not to prepare it ourselves. And just as another reminder, having sufficient funding available for all of these costs is a matter of eligibility. So if we don't have the funds identified in the PPA for these activities, then obviously we can't approve actual applications because we don't have the funds to do the work. So although NRCS is primarily responsible for all the acquisition-related costs and actions for US held easements, a partner or other third party may contribute toward a RCPP US held easement in the following ways. You can provide funds or in-kind services for design or implementation of restoration activities, provide funds or services for management activities on the easement area, like through an agreement with the landowner, provide in-kind services for outreach to disadvantaged or underserved communities, provide funds or in-kind services for the procurement of certain easement acquisition related items. For example, if the partner would like to procure an environmental record search following NRCS specifications, this may be counted as partner contribution if it's described in the PPA and other applicable agreements, like a supplemental agreement. A partner or third party may also separately provide funds into escrow for payment of easement compensation to the landowner. However, this is generally going to be uncommon because in general, NRCS will be paying full value of the easement. If a partner or third party does provide separate funds to the landowner, either for easement compensation or for any of these other items, in no circumstances will the RCPP warranty easement deed include any rights of enforcement or other interest to another party. NRCS can be the only easement holder on these. And the deeds cannot be modified. And I mentioned that before, deeds cannot be modified to accommodate any third-party requirements. So the funds and services or in-kind services I just described may potentially be counted as partner contribution under the PPA, but we have to distinguish that from any landowner contributions because generally landowner contributions cannot be counted as partner contribution in the PPA. For example, if for some reason NRCS is not paying 100% of the fair market value of the US held easement, we may consider that difference as like a landowner donation of that value, but that donated value cannot be counted as partner contribution under the PPA. Likewise, if the landowner provides funds or services for restoration or other activities on the easement area, those cannot be counted as partner contribution. So because RCPP US held easements are still new-ish and they're unique and complex, US held easement applications nationwide will be serviced by the Easement Acquisitions Branch. So that's the branch that I'm on. The Easement Acquisitions Branch, or EAB, will coordinate with the National USDA Office of General Counsel for appropriate deed and title approvals instead of the regional offices that we generally work with our other easement programs. So while EAB will be primarily responsible for the acquisition tasks, the NRCS state staff are still responsible for all the on-the-ground work, including making selections for funding, coordinating with the lead partner, and any planning activities. The first point in the process that EAB will get involved in is really in preparing the RCPP warranty easement deed. EAB can assist in selecting the appropriate deed and drafting the conservation value statement and Exhibit E where applicable. And EAB will also coordinate the reviews of the deed. So as I started out saying at the beginning of this portion of the presentation, where appropriate and to the extent practical, RCPP US held easements follow the policies and procedures we have for our other existing US held easement programs. This slide shows what that high-level process is, broken into 3 phases: the pre-acquisition, acquisition, and post-acquisition. This is definitely like a high-level view and does not list all the tasks and steps for US held easement enrollment, but it's a good summary. The green boxes show the activities that are conducted on all US held easements, irrespective of the program. The gray or blue boxes list the steps and activities that do not exist or do not exist in this manner under any other easement programs, but are applicable to RCPP US held easements. So I'm just going to highlight I'm just going to highlight the ones that are unique to RCPP. And most of this has already been mentioned in this presentation, so this is a bit of a summary or wrap up anyway. In the pre-acquisition phase, the PPA, the overarching PPA, spelling out the purposes of the project and housing the funds for all the easement activities. That's not something we have in our other easement programs. And then even at the individual easement level, selecting the appropriate deed and drafting the purpose and Exhibit E, those are unique to RCPP. During the acquisition phase, having the Easement Acquisitions Branch manage the acquisitions nationwide, that's unique for RCPP US held easements. Preparing baseline reports and identifying building envelopes for some RCPP easements, that's different than our other existing easement programs. Finally, in the post-closing phase, having variable easement purposes and terms makes monitoring enforcement more unique and singular. Not all RCPP US held easement deeds will be the same, especially when it comes to any additional permitted and prohibited activities listed in the Exhibit E. And RCPP US held easements may allow long-term use authorizations as opposed to just the short-term compatible use authorizations we have in some of our other easement programs. Next slide, and I think that's it for US held easements, and Stephanie is up.
Hello, everybody. I'm just coming on camera for a second to show my face and jump into the next section where we're going to be covering some proposal tips and the state conservationist questionnaire, but I will shut off my camera to conserve bandwidth. So this is the last section before we jump into questions. But if we go to the next slide, jump into the content. So if we look at the overarching NFO objective, the components of the NFO that we need to address within the proposal, a couple of sections that really stand out are looking at the RCPP vision and goals and the administrative priorities. Now, the proposal questions that you're going to see in the portal are written broadly, and that is to be able to capture a lot of this type of content that, what you're seeing on the screen right now is not necessarily something that is activity specific, but it is critical to what you're putting into your proposal. So for the RCPP vision and goals, you have impact, which is regarding the effective and compelling solutions that address one or more natural resource concerns. You have partner contributions, which is looking at the combination of cash and in-kind value-added contributions that can be leveraged against the RCPP funds. And then the partnership management, which is a really critical element, particularly for easements, is about the experience and expertise and the capacity of the partnership that's being identified in the proposal. So we need an entity that can acquire and hold and manage, if you're including particularly entity-held easements, U.S. held, obviously. We do the bulk of the work, but still we were looking for those entities that have familiarity with the process of easements. And then there, in the NFO, there were also 4 administrative priorities that you would be reflecting in your proposal responses. One is related to the climate smart agriculture and forestry, as you saw in the first section. And as Marcus covered, a big portion of this money is coming from inflation reduction, and that does tie very much to climate smart activities. Then we also have the advancing equity, justice, and equal opportunity. As you heard, we're doing various things that are looking at promoting historically underserved, both producers and landowners, to increase their compensation caps and participation. There's also the set aside that was made for Indian tribes, the 100 million that's available for them. So that's another priority. And urban agriculture is also another administrative priority. So these are things that, as you're weaving in easements, you want to make sure that all of those things jive and match. So if you're addressing some of those, it would still need to tie in with your easement objectives if you are doing easements, which, if you're here, is obviously a good chance. So a tool that was developed out of realizing some of the frustrations and some of the proposals that didn't always necessarily reflect all of the things that we needed in the proposal when an easement was, or easement activities were invoked, resulted in this, what we're calling the State Conservationist Questionnaire Easement Addendum. Now, you guys are probably familiar, if you've participated in the past, you're probably familiar with the overarching State Conservationist Questionnaire. This is in addition to that. And if you are looking for it, it is on the How to Apply page, and it is under the resources for submitting a proposal. Obviously, it's highlighted there in red, pretty easy to find. All right, so on the right-hand side, you can see the one-page questionnaire easement addendum. It's 7 questions, or really 13, because there's 8 embedded under number 6 and 7 for entity held and US held. It was intended to be a jumping off point. So this is not the end of the conversation. This is the start of the conversation to help give a framework of things that definitely need to be discussed. It was potential, some of you may have seen it because it was available during the fiscal year 23 PPA development session, but it wasn't available during the NFO announcement. Now, this go around, it was actually referenced in fiscal year 24 NFO. So the lead, if you guys as the lead partner, if you're not an actual entity that does acquisition and holding of an easement, but you are interested in doing that, please, we encourage you to identify those partners that would be appropriate and invite them to the conversation as you're going through this State Conservationist Questionnaire Easement Addendum specifically. So some of the other really critical components of input to think about as you're coming forward, in addition to what you're looking at with the questionnaire easement addendum, is understanding that you're going to need to be identifying the geographic scope of the project, creating a map to delineate that area. As has been said many times over, identifying and understanding those resource concerns, and the flip side, the conservation benefits, by addressing those resource concerns. And note that what you're looking at in the portal, when you see those resource concerns or conservation benefits, those are actually categories. And you really, to fully understand them, you really do need to work with your NRCS staff to understand all of the various components and actual resource concerns that are linked with those. Sometimes it's straightforward, but it's not always entirely apparent. So that is another reason why that use of the State Conservationist Questionnaire Easement Addendum is really critical. And again, those resource concerns tie directly into the conservation's value statement, which is the easement purpose statement, and those has to tie and correlate very, very strongly. It's for both entity held and US held. It also relates to land use, because we also have to be looking at the land for what it's capable of supporting. We don't want to be suggesting a piece of land that can't actually do what we're trying to do. Like if something is an upland, we wouldn't want to be trying to put that into a wetland. And in the proposal, as you're writing these responses, you want to be indicating and giving an understanding of the desired priorities. So what types of applications and criteria would be what would make an application more appealing than another. So indicating and making sure that that type of information and data is included within those narrative responses. And the application bundling actually ties a little bit to that prioritization, because even though, yes, it is literally bundling applications and you can submit them at the same time, there's actually a component of ranking prioritization that goes along with that, because as you identify those application bundles, you can have access to additional ranking points, or the applicants can receive additional points that those applications that don't meet that criteria would not be eligible for. So it's another way of really prioritizing specific types of applications that are relevant to your goals and objectives. So we'll go through a couple of slides about eligibility, starting off with the landowner eligibility. So even though you may have pre-selected parcels, or you may have some in mind, or maybe not, but regardless, it's important to understand what's coming next to be successful, to know the things that are necessary. So all current landowners of record for any of these applications would need to have evidence of current ownership. They need to be eligible for USDA payments as determined by the Farm Service Agency and NRCS. They need to have current records in the FSA system, including a farm operating plan, which is called the CCC 902. They need to be compliant with highly erodible land and wetlands conservation, otherwise known as HELWC provisions. And they need to provide they need to comply with the adjusted gross income provisions unless an actual waiver request is submitted and approved. And then they would also need to supply all information that's required by NRCS for eligibility determination. And if there are legal entities or joint operations with embedded entities and members, then a list of the full members and embedded entities with tax IDs and percentages of interest have to be identified. So moving on to the all-important land eligibility. So land may be eligible if it is private or tribal agricultural land, non-industrial private forest land, or associated land. And associated land is typically land that's associated with farms and ranches. It's nearby production or conservation lands and is not purposefully managed for food, forage, or fiber. It can be things like wetlands, riparian areas, grasslands, so those are some examples of associated land. It also, as I sort of alluded to a couple slides back, it needs to be capable of supporting the identified conservation values and the planned future condition of the proposed easement area, subject to the terms of the selected conservation easement deed. And of course, it has to be within the actual PPA project area. Okay, land eligibility continued. So the offers need to be of sufficient size and have a proper boundary configuration. There needs to be physical and legal access for the entire easement. There needs to be sufficient funds available in the RCPPA, that's a lot of P's all in a row, for all required costs. So we're talking about the technical assistance funds that NRCS might need. We're talking about restoration potentially. Everything needs to be planned out to have a viable project to be eligible. And for entity held easements only, there is the requirement that it's subject to a written pending offer. So the flip side of eligible land, we do want to think about things that make something potentially ineligible. And that would be if it's owned by a state or local government or by a non-governmental organization that's required to protect the stated conservation values. There's an exception in some small situations. If you're doing a buy, protect, sell for an entity held easement on an agricultural land, because that's a requirement for buy, protect, sell. It has to be effectively ASAP AL like, and that's different than ALE. An ALE that is not an opportunity even in a buy, protect, sell situation. It could be ineligible also if it's owned by an agency of the United, actually that's almost always going to be ineligible, but if it's owned by an Indian tribe, then it would be eligible. It would, if it's subject to an easement or deed restriction, which provides similar restoration and protections as would be provided through the RCPP easement, then it also may end up being ineligible. So some other things to think about are adverse on-site or off-site conditions that would undermine, preclude, or interfere with the purposes. Some examples: hazardous materials and permitted or existing rights-of-way, infrastructure development, or adjacent land uses that undermine the purpose of the easement. If there are unacceptable title issues, if there's not a clear title, if there isn't that legal and physical access, if you can't get the liens and mortgages subordinated, that might be ineligible. If there are third-party rights for mineral exploration, likewise could be ineligible. And if it is going to be prohibitively costly to do restoration management or monitoring, that could also be determined to be ineligible. So looking at some of the proposal questions and thinking about how to integrate the things that are coming in after the discussion with the state conservationist question or easement addendum, the bullets here are effectively covered through that state conservationist questionnaire easement addendum, but we'll just go ahead and highlight that, you know, you really want to make sure that within your proposal, you're documenting which easement type you're planning on doing, which deed selection you're wanting to do for whether it's entity held or US held. Are you wanting to use one of these new sample or model deeds? If that's the case, then that ties directly into that next main sub-bullet, because that helps provide you with the conservation value statement and is already associated with some specific potential resource concerns. So those model and sample deeds are a really great tool. If they apply for you, you can use those. But regardless, you still want to make sure that within those proposal prompts or questions, you're addressing these types of questions. And for those critical conservation areas, as Marcus pointed out in the first section, one of the priority resource concerns for that specific critical conservation area must actually be addressed by all of the activities. And so that means every easement, that deed language, would need to be able to effectively address one of those priority resource concerns. And within the NFO, there is a table that contains the CCAs, the priority resource concerns, and the crosswalk with the conservation benefits that you will normally see within the portal. And that, again, are actually the categories. And again, make sure you're having those discussions with the NRCS staff so that you can fully understand how you'll need to tie these in to those conservation value statements. And then if you are doing pre-selections, you want to make sure that you're very unambiguously naming and locating those targeted parcels, and also including a map that actually shows where those targeted parcels, so that it's very clear what it is that's being proposed as pre-selected, with the caveat that even if it's in the proposal as pre-selected, it is not guaranteed to be eligible. So for the fiscal year 24, the NFO gave some new options, as we already talked about, but just to reiterate, for the entity held, you can, as was discussed by Tim, you do have the option to potentially use an approved ASAP ALE template, and you can use the new sample deeds. You still have the option to use the minimally, moderately, and highly restrictive minimum deed terms as well, or for the for AFAs, you have minimum deed requirements that would be applicable. For the US held, you still have minimally, moderately, and highly, and now you have the NRCS model deeds that, again, are making that connection for you, that are giving you a conservation value statement and telling you these are the resource concerns that this could potentially address. A note is that, these need to be, if you're trying to use that AL template, you want to make sure that you're indicating that in your proposal write-ups, and making sure that that's clearly conveyed, that that is an interest that you have, and attaching it to project proposal. Okay, the next two slides are just a couple examples of how to try and incorporate some of the essential elements that we want captured from the State Conservation's questionnaire easement addendum. It's not everything. These are really literally just examples of how it might go. And the question or the prompt at the top, there's a comparable in both AFA and Classic. So there's a prompt in the narratives that asks for the partners to describe the RCPP activity type proposed for the project and how each identified activity will achieve conservation benefits. So in this case, we've got the Forever Land Trust, and this is obviously a fictional example, but they're saying that they've made the decision that they're going to attach the moderately restrictive deed to address long-term protection of land. And they took it to the full resource concern, which is threat of conversion to non-grassland uses. That's actual NRCS terminology. That is not crafted strictly by a partner. That is that's a conveyance of understanding of NRCS policy and terminology. Again, why it's really critical to talk with your state POCs and RCPP coordinators. In this instance, where they're saying that they want to do this easement to restore cropland to grassland, and that the easement deed, the terms, and the plan are going to be addressing field sediment, nutrient, and pathogen loss. Again, that's a specific resource concern category that's linked to the critical conservation area priority resource concern of water quality degradation. So this is weaving all of those components together to tell the story of how it's actually achieving the purposes of what it can do within RCPP. So one more example of a proposal prompt. Again, there's comparable in both Classic and AFA, where we're asking, identify any specific properties which the lead partner has determined would further objectives of this RCP project. And again, there's that caveat, pre-selected can give inclusion, but is not a guarantee of an FA award because it doesn't guarantee eligibility for one. But in this instance, the Forever Land Trust is coming forward and they are saying, this 552 acre farm and not really a county along the not really a river owned by the Green family farm is really critical to us because it's going to address the water quality concerns for the Great Lake region, and it's going to prevent conversion of non-grassland and reduce sediment and improve degraded water quality. So they're tying the resource concerns, the priority resource concerns to that CCA. The middle section there is just a reiteration that, again, if it's pre-selected, it's still not necessarily, it doesn't mean that it's met eligibility determinations. So that you really wouldn't have to put that in there because that is already a given, but that's just an example of conveying that understanding is there. So some best practices and final tips. Hopefully I've conveyed very strongly that it's really encouraged that you utilize that state conservationist questionnaire easement addendum. To be frank, not using it could actually affect ranking, because if you're not going through and thinking about all of the aspects that need to be covered in that proposal, you could very easily have holes that are not answered. And then when your proposal is evaluated, you don't get ranked as highly. So really utilize that tool to start the conversation. Again, it's not the end of the conversation. It is just a jumping off point to find out, are there any parts where we have misunderstandings or something needs to be adjusted so that you can have alignment with the RCPP purposes. And this is using this, even if you have to meet more than one time, is really setting up the stage for exactly how the project will need to go forward, because consistent, continual communication is required. This is the partnership program. So it really is about having that partnership and meeting and talking and discussing. You also want to make sure, as you guys have probably gotten tired of hearing, but those conservation values need to be very clearly identified and understood. And you guys need to be sharing that you're understanding how they connect with the specific resource concerns that you've identified. And for entity held easements, the easement holder is going to be the one who's responsible for their own due diligence, much the same way if you worked with ASAP ALE, it's the same way. The due diligence and acquisition and surveys, that's all the responsibility of the entity. It can be counted as contribution, but it's their responsibility. And then for the U.S. held, as was already covered by Michael, it is the responsibility of the easement acquisition branch to administer those acquisitions. And if you have a specific easement deed like the ASAP ALE deed or an alternative easement valuation, those need to be identified and attached at the proposal stage. And for an alternative valuation, that has to get submitted to the national appraiser's inbox, as is indicated in the NFO, but we'll share in a subsequent slide. Okay, so I feel like the pre-selections I've sort of covered, but just as a reminder that you can identify pre-selected parcels if that works with what your objectives of your project are. It's definitely not a requirement, but if you are, you want to make sure that those are very clearly named and delineated. There is a section within the proposal to list those, as I used in the example. And then again, about the application bundles that I covered way back in the beginning of my section, that's not just the literal bundling of applications, but it is an opportunity to really identify criteria that you would potentially give additional points for, whether it's within a specific watershed or has a specific habitat, or whatever the case may be, that you would select and say these applications that have this would be eligible to receive these application bundle points effectively. And I think that's it for that slide. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the PPA, and you may already understand what it is, but the programmatic partnership agreement that we really usually always refer to as the PPA is the agreement that creates the bridge between the programmatic requirements and the project's individual applications. The PPA documents the expected deed, including the level of restrictiveness of the easement activities, and the PPA is used to inform what type of easement will be acquired through the project, and has information that is relevant to the development of the conservation values, those ever important conservation values. If it doesn't include the actual conservation value statement, you're still getting there. You're still making those connections between those resource concerns and where those expected conservation value statements are going to go. The key element include things like the purpose and objectives and priorities and ranking, the conservation benefits and conservation values. That's listed on the right-hand side. There is a note there that says that a PPA amendment may be needed to achieve alignment. So effectively, the PPA is a living document. As we find that things need to be adjusted, they can. That doesn't guarantee that, if we're changing funds, that's not necessarily a guarantee. You need to make sure that you have enough funds requested from the start and in the correct categories, but you can still request changes, and we do our best to accommodate, and sometimes it is just straight up necessary to achieve that programmatic alignment. So to recap some of the changes that happened with this fiscal year 24 NFO, you know that it was already talked about in the entity held section. The federal share increased for historically underserved when they're the landowner, or it's going to be conveyed to a historically underserved, up to 75% for classic or 65% for AFA. The overarching AFA share, for obviously AFA is only entity held, so that can be up to 40% of the easement value there in fiscal year 24. Now you do also have the opportunity, if you are an ASAP ALE certified entity, you can avail yourselves to those flexibilities if you identify it in the proposal at that proposal stage. And as has already been said, you've got the model deeds for US held and the sample deeds for entity held that are making those conservation value statements available and linking it to resource concerns. Those alternative valuations are still an option as they were in 23. You can use the ALE deed template and the all-important State Conservationist Questionnaire Easement Addendum. Got left off of there, but we're specifically talking about the Easement Addendum. The overarching questionnaire existed in 23. So if you have additional questions after this is over, in addition to what's available on the RCPP website, you've got the rcpp@usda.gov inbox where partners can submit all types of RCPP questions, not just easement related questions. And then if you have, if you're interested in seeking the alternative valuations, that's the second email is the National Appraisers inbox. The primary point of contact, of course, is usually your RCPP coordinator. And then there is a new RCPP easement resources library that contains minimum deed terms and US held easement forms. We'll go through a couple slides to show you where that stuff is. Next slide. So if you are looking for this new RCPP easement resources library and you're on the main RCPP page, you'll see under RCPP conservation activities, there is a little hyperlink at the bottom of that that'll take you to the RCPP easement page. Next slide. And there you will find the RCPP easement resources library. And the next few slides have the content that you can find in the resources library. So next slide. You can see that there are entity held deeds. That's the list that was there. I pulled that yesterday, so it should still be current. Next slide. And the 5 that are there currently for US held. Next slide. And then there will be a forthcoming conservation values statement resource that will help with things beyond the model and sample deeds to help partners with that understanding of resource concerns versus conservation value statements. That should be coming very soon. Then the process aids, which is the questionnaire easement addendum, and the valuation aid for appraisal specifications.